Good afternoon. Today I will talk about Chapter 3, Settling the English Colonies. The promise of riches, especially tobacco, in Virginia and Maryland and rice in South Carolina will draw the first settlers to the southern colonies. Religious devotion primarily shaped the earliest settlements in the New England colonies. Colonists in both the North and South shared a common language and English heritage, but the colonies in the North and the South had different patterns of settlement, different economies, different political systems, and even different sets of values. Factors leading to the first major European migration or English migration were a population explosion, economic depression, and religious repression against English Calvinists. Remember the last time we talked about the establishment of Virginia and then Maryland along the Chesapeake Bay? Both of these colonies will select tobacco as their export staple crop, and the cultivation of tobacco in Jamestown and Virginia colony as well as Maryland resulted in four things: the destruction of the soil, great demand for controlled labor, soaring prosperity in the colony, and the broad acre plantation system will develop along the winding rivers that flowed out of the interior of Virginia, east of the Appalachian Mountains. And because of the quick depletion of soil due to tobacco cultivation, white farmers, white tobacco planters will always have to be on the move westward for new fertile land, which meant encroachment and conflict with Native Americans. 1619 is an important year in the history of not only the Virginia colony but early America, because it was the year martial law in Virginia ended. It's the year that blacks from Africa first arrived in English America at Jamestown, and in the Virginia colony, the House of Burgesses was established. The summoning of Virginia's House of Burgesses marked an important precedent because it was the first of many legislative assemblies to meet in America. And one of the great traditions that the British will forget and ignore at the beginning of the American Revolution is that the American colonies had basically had self-representation as well as self-taxation from the very beginning of their history. What happened after the first 20 slaves were sold to Virginia settlers, including John Rolfe, by a Dutch captain whose ship has blown off course, and he needed provisions to get back to the Netherlands? Well, nothing, very little, because after the purchase of Africans in 1619 by Jamestown settlers from a Dutch captain, additional purchases of Africans were very few because they were too costly. And in 1650, almost 30 years later, Virginia counted but 300 blacks, and their status was unclear. Some were indentured servants who gained their freedom, and some were slaves. So there's only 300 blacks, although by the end of the century, blacks most of them enslaved, made up approximately 14% of the colony's population. Now, the one important difference between the founding and establishment of Virginia and Maryland was that Virginia was founded mainly as an economic venture, while Maryland was intended partly to secure religious freedom for persecuted Roman Catholics. And remember, one reason why Lord Baltimore will issue the Act of Toleration in 1649 is that Protestants were soon outnumbering a Catholic minority, and he wanted to make sure that there was toleration of Catholicism and the worship of that religion. So despite its problems, Maryland prospered, growing tobacco just like Virginia, and before 1700, it and Virginia depended on labor of white indentured servants who came from England, both male and female. Sugar is a different matter. Sugar was called a rich man's crop because it had to be planted extensively. It required the clearing of much land. It was a capital intense business, and it required an elaborate refining process that there's a drawing of. Where was this grown? In the British Empire. It was grown in the British West Indies or the Caribbean sugar plantations of Jamaica and Barbados. And the labor system on these two islands that almost solely grew sugar was the importation of African slaves. And as a result, the slave codes of England's Barbados colony will lay the basis for slavery in North America. Under the Barbados Slave Code, slaves were denied the most fundamental rights, and according to the 1661 Barbados Slave Code, slaves who attempted to fight back against physical assaults by white men would be severely whipped, would have their noses cut, would be burned with a hot iron, and could be killed or dismembered with no charges being brought against the master or responsible white person. And by about 1700, on Jamaica and Barbados, black slaves outnumbered white settlers in the English West Indies. The colony of South Carolina will be first settled by English settlers who come from Barbados, who basically have no more opportunity to acquire land and wealth on that English island. And as a result, the colony of South Carolina was prosper by developing close economic ties with the British Caribbean and Barbados. The first export item that South Carolina and the early Carolinians sent to the Caribbean sugar islands is that they sent Indian slaves. Later on, they will develop the cultivation of rice, and that's why African slaves will be at the very beginning of South Carolina's history. Why? Because some Africans proved to be especially valuable as slaves in South Carolina because they were experienced in rice cultivation in their homeland of West Africa along the Niger River. And by 1710, African slaves were a majority of Carolinians. But in the north, there will be a different pattern of settlement. We have the flight of poor farmers and religious dissenters from planter-run and planter-dominated Virginia that will lead to the establishment of the most independent-minded North Carolina colony. Most of the early white settlers in North Carolina were religious dissenters who did not want to have to attend the Church of England and pay taxes to a church that was not their own. Also, they were poor white farmers fleeing aristocratic-controlled Virginia. They were very democratic, the first settlers in North Carolina. And many of them had been repelled by the rarefied atmosphere of Virginia, dominated as it was by big plantation gentry belonging to the Church of England. And the newcomers to North Carolina, or what will become North Carolina, were frequently squatters without legal right to the soil. Also, they raised their tobacco and other crops on small farms with little need for African slaves. And as a result of its settlement and those who came to settle in North Carolina and Rhode Island were similar in that they were the two most democratic colonies, the most independent-minded, and the least aristocratic of the original 13 English colonies. And in fact, the inhabitants of North Carolina were regarded by their neighbors to the south, South Carolina, as outcasts and irreligious today. And South Carolina still holds a superior view of themselves when it comes in comparison with North Carolina. The final colony to be established in the South will be to the southwest of South Carolina, and it will become the colony of Georgia. High-minded philanthropists led by James Oglethorpe founded Georgia Colony as a as a haven for people in prison for debt. Because in 17th century England and many countries in Europe, if you go into debt, you can be put in prison without any recourse. But the real reason that the British monarchy and government approved the establishment of the colony of Georgia was that it was to be founded as a defensive buffer for the Carolinas against Spanish and Indian attacks from Florida. But Georgia will grow very slowly. It will have the least population of all the original 13 colonies for several reasons. One, the Georgia colony grew very slowly because of its unhealthy climate, early restrictions on black slavery, which will eventually be lifted, and Spanish attacks that thwarted the development of a plantation economy. So Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia were similar in that they were all economically devoted to exporting commercial agricultural products. In Georgia and South Carolina, it will be rice. In North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, it will be tobacco. The wide scattering of plantations and farms, often along stately rivers going inland, retarded the growth of cities and made the establishments of churches and schools both difficult and expensive. And this will be a trait and characteristic of all the southern colonies before the American Revolution. These colonies were in some degree expansionary. Soil butchery by excessive tobacco growing drove settlers westward along the long, lazy rivers that invited penetration of the interior, and there will be continuing confrontation with Native Americans. So one statement about the southern plantation colonies is by 1750, they based their economies on the production of staple crops for export, rice in South Carolina and Georgia, and tobacco in North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. All practiced slavery to some degree. All provided tax support for the Anglican Church or the Church of England. And it had very few large cities. Only Charleston, South Carolina will be a town and city of substantial size and population before the American Revolution. But in the North is different. Remember, as a result of Henry VIII's breaking with the church, with the Catholic Church and the Pope in Rome, we will have Protestant ideas and doctrine penetrate the Church of England, and it will be in the form of Calvinism. John Calvin basically stressed correct behavior. He believed in predestination, conversion, and the doctrine of the elect. In Calvinism, the conversion was an intense personal experience when God revealed an individual's heavenly destiny, hell or heaven, and in Puritan doctrine, the elect were also referred to as visible saints. Puritans were Calvinists, and especially attracted England's economically depressed economically depressed farmers in eastern and southwestern England. The most fervent Puritans, who will become known as separatists, believed that the Church of England was corrupt because it did not restrict its membership to visible saints who had experienced a conversion. And remember, what's a conversion experience? Is when God reveals to an individual what his eternal fate would be. And if it was to be heaven, then if he's male, he becomes a visible saint. So Henry VIII aided the entrance of Protestant beliefs, mainly Calvinism, into England when he broke England's ties with the Catholic Church and the Pope in Rome. The separatists were the radical Puritans who believed that the Church of England should restrict its membership to only visible saints. They are also known as pilgrims. and they will come into conflict with the new king who succeeds Elizabeth I, King James I. And he opposed the separatists, who basically said no bishop, no king. He opposed the separatists who wanted to break away entirely from the Church of England because he realized that if his subjects could defy him in spiritual behavior or matters, they could defy him as a political leader. And as a result, James I and his government will target the separatists, and they will be forced to leave and migrate from England to Holland. They will stay there several years. They will enjoy religious toleration and will be able to practice religion the way they see fit. But the problem is that their children are becoming Dutch, not English. So they will contact the Virginia Company and gain a charter, and they will sail across the Atlantic in the Mayflower. So the separatists migrated from England to Holland to the New World in order to avoid their children being raised or becoming Dutch. And the principal motivation shaping the earliest settlements in New England, first the separatists or pilgrims and then the Puritans, was religious commitment and devotion. The irony of the Mayflower passengers is that the majority of them were not separatists. It's what separatists call strangers. And before they disembarked and began settlement and colonization, all the men agreed to a document and signed it called the Mayflower Compact. And the reality is it was not self-government or democracy, but it was just an agreement by all the men present who signed that they would agree and follow all laws that was passed by the majority. The second group to come, who came when Civil War broke out in 1642, between Charles II, who is staunchly Catholic, and the Parliament, the House of Commons, we will have many Puritans leave in what's called the Puritan migration. But if you look at the map in your textbook, only a tiny minority will come to New England. Many will go to the West Indies and to the Chesapeake, as well as Bermuda. So the second colony to be established in New England is the Massachusetts Bay Colony led by William Bradford. Unlike the separatists, Puritans remained members of the Church of England. And initially, the Massachusetts Bay Colony enjoyed the advantages of being a well-equipped expedition, starting off on a larger scale than any other English colony, receiving many fairly prosperous and educated immigrants, and all shared a common purpose when they came to North America and New England. The Puritan belief that their government was based on a covenant with God led to the restriction of political participation in colonial Massachusetts government and town councils to visible saints. And one reason the Massachusetts Bay Colony was not a true democracy was that only church members, male visible saints, could vote for the governor and the general court, which was the colonial legislature. But even when there is this restriction, the proportion of qualified voters in this colony as compared to England was larger. Even though the Puritan clergy could not hold office, they will greatly influence the government, who will basically try to regulate correct behavior and morality. And you could either be flogged, you could be put in stocks, you could be shunned, or the most severe punishment would be exile. If you went against the teachings and beliefs of the Puritan Church in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first to do this was Anne Hutchinson. The essential heresy that caused Anne Hutchinson to be convicted and banished or exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony was her declared belief that she had received a direct revelation from God, in other words, that she had become a visible saint, and that the saved, the elect, did not need to obey either human or divine law. When in reality, Puritan doctrine and beliefs taught that the elect should be the greatest example of correct and moral behavior for all the others who have not had a conversion experience. And more importantly, what got her in trouble was she a woman who had a great deal of knowledge and education and knew the Bible very well. So she will be banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony for her beliefs. She will be pregnant, and she will head to Rhode Island, and we'll talk why in a minute. She will eventually end up in New York, where she and most of her family members will be killed by Indians. The second person to get in trouble with the Puritan clergy and the Massachusetts Bay government was Roger Williams, who was not a Puritan but was a separatist. So he advocated that the church in the Massachusetts Bay Colony should separate from the Church of England, but it would not. Also, he questioned the legality of the Massachusetts Bay Charter. He believed that the Indians had been abused, and he claimed that the colony's civil government should not regulate religious behavior. This was a radical thought because no matter whether the country was Catholic or Protestant, individuals did not have free choice of religion, and the monarch and government determined what your religion would be. So Roger Williams based the religious freedom of his colony of Rhode Island on his belief that civil government had no right to regulate religious behavior or individual conscience. So with the aid of Indians, when he is finally banished after recovering from an extensive illness, he will establish Rhode Island in 1636. And as the founder of Rhode Island, Roger Williams will establish complete religious freedom for all. In fact, Jews could come to Rhode Island, which is the only English colony in North America where they could come and settle. So as a colony, Rhode Island became known for its individualist and independent attitudes. And the most distinctive feature of the Rhode Island colony was that it enjoyed the most complete religious freedom of all the English colonies. But like other settlers in North America on the east coast of the continent, they moved west because land quickly played out and was depleted. So they will move to the southwest, north and west of Rhode Island, and they will establish New Haven, then Hartford, and this will be the foundation for the Connecticut River Colony. And unlike other English voyagers and settlers in the New World, the Puritans transplanted entire communities. They did not migrate as individual families, but as groups. And as a result of their expansion, they will come into conflict with Native Americans. But even before the first English settlement in New England, the separatists came, Indians in the region had been devastated by the epidemics of diseases caused by contact with English fishermen. And when the Pilgrims or Separatists land in 1620, they will barely survive the first winter, and they will gain the help of Squanto and Maciot, and as a result, they will celebrate Thanksgiving the next fall after their first embarkation on the continent. There will be a Pequot War in the 1630s in which the Narragansetts and the Puritans will be allies, and they will basically destroy the Pequot nation. And as encroachment and expansion kept moving west, New England Indians' only hope of resisting English encroachment lay in intertribal unity against the English. And the man who will preach this and advocate this among the Native American peoples of New England will be Massasoit's son, called Metacom or King Philip. And this will lead to war, 1675-1676. In this war, 52 Puritan towns will be attacked and 12 will be entirely destroyed, with hundreds of colonists being killed, as well as many more Native Americans. King Philip's or Metacom's War resulted in the lasting defeat of the New England's Indians, the death of hundreds of colonists and many more Indians, the destruction of 12 Puritan towns, and the beheading of Chief Metacom and the sale of his wife and son into slavery to the Caribbean. But during these early years of settlement in the South and in New England, England paid little attention to its North American colonies. The New England Confederation was created in 1643 by royal authority and was designed to bolster colonial defense and maintain a military alliance against the French, the Dutch, as well as the Native Americans. Later on, the Dominion of New England will be established. Its governor will be Sir Edmund Andros, who is an able military man, conscientious but tactless due to his flaunting his Anglican faith in a Puritan enclave. The goal of the Dominion of New England was to streamline the administration of its colonies, was designed to bolster colonial defense, but a new goal was to basically throttle trade with countries not ruled by England. In other words, this is the beginning of what will become known as mercantilism, in which that American colonies could only trade with Britain itself or British colonies. As a result of Sir Edmund Andros's rule, the power of town meetings was curbed in New England. Because the Dominion of New England included all the New England colonies, officials tried to enforce the navigation laws, which wanted to eliminate colonial American trade with any country or port that was not English. Smuggling was suppressed, and taxes were levied without the consent of elected representatives and assemblies. But in 1688, James II, who had been the Duke of York, who had been the English commander when the English had seized New Amsterdam and New Netherland and made it New York City and New York, he will be thrown off the throne in what is called the Glorious Revolution. And he will be succeeded by his daughter and her husband, who are both Protestant, William and Mary. They will relax the royal grip on colonial trade, and the navigation laws were only weakly enforced after their accession to the throne. And this is the beginning of what historians call a salutary neglect, in which the British government will basically ignore the everyday activities and actions of the North American colonies, and it will be very beneficial to the North American colonists. The last middle colony to be established will be Pennsylvania. Its establishment and settlement or creation will be traced to a religious sect that was harassed and persecuted in England and throughout Europe. It's the Society of Friends, or better known as the Quakers. And one of the traits that made Quakers unpopular in England was their refusal to do military service and take an oath of allegiance. They swore solemn oaths of faith and devotion. They advocated passive resistance and turning the other cheek against their enemies. They will build simple meeting houses and believe that they were all children in the sight of God. But they are very shrewd and good businessmen. And as a result of English persecution of Quakers in England, William Penn will establish what will become known as the Colony of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the best advertised colony. Besides Pennsylvania, Quakers were also heavily involved in the early settlement of both New Jersey and Delaware. And economically, the colony of Pennsylvania became profitable very quickly. One reason why is that William Penn and the colony's founders will actively seek settlers from Germany and other non-British countries. And their policy towards Indians is very benevolent and fair. They will basically engage in fair negotiations with Native Americans to acquire the land that will become Pennsylvania. Three things about Pennsylvania. It will introduce an unusually liberal land and religious policies that attracted a heavy flow of immigrants, including the Scots-Irish, who had originally been Scots but had been settled in Northern Ireland by the British and now came to the frontier beginning in Pennsylvania, and they will spread southward along the Appalachian Mountains, and as well as Germans. 2, Pennsylvania had fertile soil that produced surplus grain for export and was founded with the intention of making a profit, which it will quickly begin doing. The middle colonies of New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New York had 2 common traits. All were notable for their fertile soil and their unusual degree of ethnic diversity.